Hello there, John Owens here, and this is another recorded interview for Badass, which is not very rude, but is in fact business analysts and data analysts who want to excel in what they're doing. And we're with, for this expert interview, Daragh O'Brien, and I'm in Kerry, North Island, New Zealand. Daragh is in Dublin, in the country where I was born, bred and brought up. And through this, which I still find magic that we're able to talk to each other, I saw this on Star Trek at one time and I thought, wouldn't that be great? And here we are. Now Daragh is my go-to person for all things GDPR. And Daragh, good morning to you. It's just gone 8 a.m. in Dublin. Good morning.
Good morning and good evening to you.
Yes, and it's been a lovely evening here. It's a really balmy spring day. Now, we were talking just before the program began and about your experience. It's so long that I thought it'd be better to ask you, you're all now with GDPR, but your connection with the European Union data protection goes back quite a few years, doesn't it?
Well, I'm a hardcore business side data guy from my time in the telco. So when I was running single view of customer, when I was running regulatory, data protection law and data protection compliance was a key element of that. Prior to that, again, as a law student, I had some arguments with the law faculty in the 90s about why they weren't teaching this as a subject, because I could see that it was a key issue. So fast forward to now, since 2012, I've been involved in some of the early drafts and early consultations on GDPR, and we've been working actively with clients since 2012, 2013 in Castlebridge to help get them ready. Because while the detail was still emerging, just like a good agile project, we knew what the themes were going to be. We knew what the key epics were for the use cases, and we were getting people moving early to try and get ahead of the curve.
Excellent. Now I'm going to ask you some questions which may seem simplistic, but it is just that simple one. The very first question I'm going to ask you, because everybody thinks they'll have the answer to it, but what is GDPR?
At its simplest, GDPR is a regulation from the European Union, and that regulation relates to the handling and processing of data about people, or data that relates to people, or data that identifies people in electronic or manual form. So it's a technology neutral piece of legislation. And the importance of the word regulation from an EU perspective is that it has direct effect in member states. So there's no need for any individual EU member state to do anything. This becomes law on the 25th of May. Well, it is law now, and it comes into force on the 25th of May, 2018. Among the key changes in GDPR are a recodification of the core fundamental principles of data privacy in Europe, and the introduction of a new principle. Well, not a new principle, but the bringing forward of an old principle called the accountability principle, which was buried in the mire of how you actually had to go about doing data protection stuff previously. But now they've brought it up and they've said, this is actually a principle. And if you're not doing these things, that's an offense under the legislation. And the accountability principle, for those of us in the data world, is basically the mandate from God for data governance. Because what it says is that there are core principles for data privacy around fairness, transparency, minimizing the amount of data you're processing, so you only have the minimum you need for the purpose you have, limiting how much data you're storing, keeping it accurate. But the accountability principle says you have to be able to demonstrate that you have controls in place for those things and that they are effective. So I call it the John F. Kennedy sentence in the GDPR. Kennedy said, "It's this nation's stated objective to land a man safely on the moon." NASA engineers cheered because they could do that bit. And then he kept talking, and then return him safely to the Earth again. That was going to be the problem for NASA, getting the astronauts back. And that demonstration of accountability is one of the key challenges in GDPR.
Excellent. Nicely put. I like almost the first time I've heard anything about GDPR almost poetically put there.
Well, you have to come to the Irish for the poetry.
That's true. That's true. Now, does it only apply to companies operating within the EU?
No, it doesn't. It applies to any organization that is engaged in the processing of data of people who are physically located in the European Union. It's not defined on people's residency status or their citizenship, but their geographical location. So if you are a New Zealand-based company that is selling into the EU market, or that is processing data on a large scale of EU citizens, so if you're operating an analytics service that's been used by companies in the EU, well, you're going to have to comply with GDPR as well, which means that as a company outside the European Union, you'll have to nominate a representative. So there has to be a point of contact in EU member states where the regulators can knock on the door and come and ask for questions and have tea and biscuits with you if something goes wrong, or where people who are affected by your processing can contact and register their complaint or ask questions in terms of exercising their rights. So this is transnational, international effect. And when this was being rolled out, I remember presenting on this in the States in 2012 and 2013. A lot of American attendees at events were saying, well, that's incredibly unfair. How can the EU do this? And I responded with 2 words, Sarbanes-Oxley. Because when I was in the phone company, we had to run a Sarbanes-Oxley program because we had some finance listed in New York. And we had to do a full Sarbanes-Oxley program as a result. So this is the equivalent in terms of if you're handling data that is relating to people who are physically in the European Union, so it's the EU 28 member states currently, but soon to be 27, then you have to comply with GDPR.
Excellent. And what are the things that would bring you into breach of GDPR?
One of the simplest things is if you don't tell people what you're going to do with their data. One of the key fundamental requirements in GDPR is a principle of fairness, lawfulness, and transparency. And there are specific requirements in the GDPR about telling people what you're going to do with their data. What's the purpose you have it for? How long are you going to keep it for? Who might you be sharing it with? What basis are you sharing it with people, with those other entities? And if you're transferring the data outside of the European Union or European Economic Area, which is the EU plus Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. So there's your table quiz question for the weekend, John. Name the countries of the European Economic. If you're transferring data outside those countries, demonstrating the basis under which that transfer is happening. So New Zealand is what's called a safe country in EU terms. So we've looked at your data. The European Commission has looked at the data privacy laws in New Zealand and said they're good. We can work with them. They're an equivalent standard. But again, that's a rolling review. So data moving from Europe to New Zealand, there's a basis there. But if you're moving data from Europe to New Zealand, you'll have to disclose it. And not complying with those things, not thinking about the basis you're transferring data, not thinking about what you're using it for, and not telling people. That's usually that's kind of the key area where organizations fall down. There's a whole lot of other areas, but it's a 209-page document, John, with 99 articles. We could be here for a week.
No. I think we'll use the Pareto principle here and hope that we'll do with 10% covering 90%. Yeah.
One of the other aspects, though, it's not just telling people; it's also internally documenting what you're doing with data, documenting controls, and having evidence of your effectiveness. Before that was a nice to have. Now that's actually defined as a set of offences under GDPR, failing to have your governance structures in place.
Wow, so all those people talking about data governance, those old fuddy-duddies, are now people saying, oh, I wish we'd done that.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah, because what you have to do is document your processing activities from the macro level down to a level of granularity where you've identified the key risks, because GDPR is ultimately a risk-based model. So you have to identify the risks in the processing, identify your categories of data that you're processing. You're into metadata world there, and document that, and then have controls over that to make sure that that documentation is kept up to date, but also that any changes in the process are being managed and governed correctly. So there's a huge mandate for data governance, master data management, and metadata management within GDPR.
Excellent. And by metadata, you're meaning data that describes the structure and form of data.
Data that describes other data. So it's kind of business metadata. So the ontology and classification of the business data you have. So when we say customer, well, the old joke in the phone company was if you got 15 people in a room to define customer, you come out with 20 definitions. GDPR requires you to narrow that down.
Excellent. I think that this will help people, because one of my old always fall out with so many people talking about metadata when they were really talking about descriptive data, you know, and this now brings it home. So that's going to bring governance and these definitions together. So it's doing a great job of putting MDM and single party at the center of the thing, because the party is, it doesn't matter what relationship you have with them. There could be a customer, supplier. If you're holding it, they are a party, and what role they play is secondary to the fact that you need to hold the data.
Exactly, and the role may dictate the length of time you should be holding the data for, and other issues and matters that fall out of that.
Excellent. Well, that's nice, because that then if you have the party at the center and you have the role linked to the party, you can actually link the legislation about length, etc., to the role, and that would mandate and govern what you would do. So that could make it nice. So a really good, a clear model here would make all this relatively easy. But how many companies do you think are ready for that with a clear architecture for what the data ought to look like?
Well, I think what's happening with a lot of organizations is particularly larger organizations, they've started this in silos in various areas, and it's not that they don't have a model, it's that they've got lots of models, and they need to very quickly distill it down into at least one working model for GDPR. And that's the key mandate. There's a time period on this. The 25th of May is when it comes into force. And after that point in time, if you have deficiencies in your control system, if something goes wrong, you won't be able to point to a mitigating factor when you're talking to the friendly regulators. And that's where the mandate comes to actually start tackling this. And as you move down into smaller organizations, GDPR applies not to just large organizations, any organization that is holding data and processing data about people, from your corner street garage up to your large cloud platform as a service provider. They all have to comply with the same general principles. Now, there are some small carve-outs in it. One of the key ones is around the documentation. So if you're a small business with less than 250 people, you might be able to argue you don't have to document your processing activities. But as I've been saying to clients who have less than 250 staff, when you write your processes down, it means you can go on holidays.
It is so true, you know, because people don't realize this. Writing these processes down ought not be, you know, burdensome. Guess what? It'll simplify everything. It'll make life easier, and it'll make you compliant, you know. Now, what are the current penalties for breach?
Okay, under GDPR, the headline that everyone talks about are two key categories of penalty: 4% of global turnover for the organization, or 20 million euro, or 2% of turnover, or 10 million euro. So the 4% fines are for breaches of the core principles. So if you don't have the transparency right, if you're capturing more or processing more information than you need, if you're holding it for an indefinite period of time without a reason, they're the principles that are going to get you the big penalties potentially. But the 2% of turnover, I call them the offences against the paperwork fines. This is where you don't have your governance, you don't have your controls, you haven't got documented processes for doing things like responding to a request for a copy of someone's data. Not having those things thought out, not having your administrative structures in place, are actually offences that are subject to fines under GDPR at 2% of turnover, or 10 million euro. But the fines are just one of 13 or 14 things that a regulator has in their toolbox. The non-fine sanction they can hit you with is, among the non-fine sanctions they can hit you with, is asking you not to process the data, asking you to delete the data, asking you to change your processing in a time period they'll define, not that you'll define. And that just builds out. So there is going to be staged enforcement. I think it's going to be highly unlikely that organizations are going to get hit with the huge fines early on, but they will be asked to change things, stop doing things, get rid of data. And that's things that are currently done by regulators in Europe on a regular basis. Like the Irish regulator recently asked a water utility to delete social insurance numbers that they didn't have a reason to have, that they've been gathering. So they had to get rid of all of those. The other aspect of the sanctions under GDPR is that people can sue a company for breaching their data privacy rights. Now, they can do this currently, but in some of EU member states, you have to show that you've suffered a loss, an actual tangible damage as a result. GDPR makes it explicitly clear. You won't have to show any actual loss. So it makes it a strict liability test. I don't know how familiar you are with public liability law, John, but there's the classic case from the UK called Rylands versus Fletcher, where a nice man gathered lots of toxic chemicals in his farm at the top of a hill, and then one day there was a flood and all the chemicals rushed down the hill in the farm. And the legal principle there is that if you gather the noxious stuff on your land, you are responsible for anything that happens straight away if anything goes wrong. And GDPR is a similar set of principles. Once you've started down the road of processing data about people and gathering it, all the rules attach to you, all the rules apply to you, and if you've chosen not to comply with them, well, you can be sued, and if someone can demonstrate that you didn't meet the required standard of care, you're writing a check. You're paying people for a damage. Then the other aspect as well is there is potential for personal liability for officers and directors of companies. This is something that will vary across member states. So it's one of the areas where member states have some discretion under the GDPR what they do in this regard. But in Ireland, we currently have the legal principle that a director or officer of a body corporate can be held personally liable if through their consent, connivance or negligence a breach of the law of the data privacy laws has occurred. That's carrying forward under GDPR, and the penalties are going to be quite high personally for directors. So this is something where the message is quite clear. You have to take this seriously.
Excellent. And you were just talking about the number of, earlier on, the number of member states dropping by one, of course. But, of course, the UK are still going to not be able to escape GDPR.
No, the UK are having to implement GDPR anyway, just purely by mathematics. They have to. And they have published their draft data protection bill, which has some interesting things in it. Among the interesting things it has in it is that rather than take the perfectly good definitions of core concepts that are in the GDPR, they've come up with their own definitions that are different, which straight away undermines post-Brexit. The UK will have to be applying for a thing called an adequacy decision, much like New Zealand has for cross-border data transfers, because they'll be out of the club. And if they're out of the club and their laws are different and they're not meaningfully equivalent and meaningfully adequate protections, well, there could be challenges for companies based in the UK or basing their processing of data and their management of data in the UK complying with the GDPR in that context.
But if you're outside Europe, you could say, well, what are you going to do? You can't sue us because we're not in the EU.
But you can, there are various sanctions, various mechanisms at international level that can be implemented. Also, because of the requirement to have a representative in the country, etc., there are various mechanisms available. And also there is a lot of international cooperation amongst regulators now. So while an organization might be outside of the European Union, so a New Zealand organization, if they decided to play fast and loose with GDPR, that might result in European regulators contacting the New Zealand regulator and saying, we have concerns about the practices of this company. We think you should look into it. Here is the information we have gathered. There's a lot of international cooperation between privacy regulators. And as a result, you might find that you're getting a knock on the door from closer to home if you're in a country that has a good regulator. In the US, the FTC prosecutes organizations quite a lot for breaches of Section 5 of the FTC Act, which is about transparency and consumer contract terms and did you do what you said you would do? And if you don't do what you said you would do, then they will hit you with 30-year privacy audits and a whole host of horrible penalties like that. So to take the view that because you're outside the EU, nothing's going to happen to you will be a risk. You could take that position, but eventually there will be some level of enforcement.
Yeah, and the same applies now to the United States, and which you were mentioning there. But those, and that, do you think that'll continue?
The United States is an interesting one because we have just this week we had the Irish High Court referred model clauses, which are one of the mechanisms for transferring data to the US. They're standard contract terms that are agreed by the European Commission for use. They've been referred to the European Court of Justice to see do they meet the standards of EU law. And there was a whole hearing in the Irish High Court where evidence was given about the oversight and control of the intelligence services in the United States. And the Irish High Court decided there was a matter of law that needed to be referred to the European Court of Justice. We also have Privacy Shield, which is currently undergoing a review. And given that a lot of the jobs, a lot of the roles that were defined and agreed as needing to be in place for Privacy Shield to be effective, haven't been appointed by the Trump administration, I would be very concerned at the Privacy Shield would be found to be functional. We may find that there's a warning at this stage and the matter will be reviewed. But cross-border data transfer, transatlantic data transfer is a significantly problematic area at the moment, which is why we like countries with sensible laws like New Zealand.
Yes, it is. Oh, they're pretty sensible, yes, the New Zealanders, it is. Now, thanks, Daragh, thank you so much for that. If you were asked, to give, and you may well be part of your job, imagine you were asked to give an enterprise just 5 steps to prepare for GDPR compliance. Here you are, you're going down the elevator, you've got 3 minutes to do this. What are the 5 steps you would advise them?
Okay, first thing I'd say is don't panic. And the reason I say don't panic, first of all, is organizations are looking at this and they're either deciding not to do anything because they're waiting to see how things pan out because they're terrified of the potential, or they are simply locked in paralysis by analysis. A third reason is the 25th of May 2018 is Tell Day. It's Douglas Adams' birthday. So there's a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy theme here. There's a lot of stuff in GDPR, but don't panic. The second thing I'd say is take your business cards out. Get all your senior executives to take their business cards out and scratch out the word director of or head of on their business card. And the other word, the noun that's there, that is a function in the organization that may have data about people in it. And they need to find out what types of data about people they are handling. Then drill into why. And so at that point, you're getting into the level of documenting your data from the top down, your processing activities. Then you need to look at what you've told people. What permissions have you got? Verify that you're if the only reason you're holding the data and processing the data is based on consent, the rules have changed around consent, so you need to look at that and look at the data. And I was doing this exercise with a client yesterday. We were going through their CRM system and looking at what percentage of the data was in the gray area, the unknown unknowns, and trying to determine what was the monetary impact to the bottom line of that to make a risk-based approach, a risk-based assessment of what to do next, rather than simply, oh, we're going to lose 94% of our customer base. What are we going to do? Well, are these customers who have actually interacted with you in the last 3 years? If not, is there a loss there really, or are you you're clearing out the chaff potentially in your database? And there are the key things. Don't panic. Figure out what your functions are. Figure out what the data is at a high level. And then on. And I keep seeing the word compliance, and organizations wanted to be in full compliance by the 25th of May. Unless you have hired in years, not going to be in compliance by the 25th of May 2018, because this is a risk-based model apart from anything else. Once you declare compliance, if you declare compliance at 9 o'clock in the morning, at 9:15, someone will do something stupid. You have to focus on your risk management, you have to focus on your controls, and the first thing is, what are you doing with data, and what data about people do you have, and why do you have it? That's a very quick desk exercise you can do, standing around a whiteboard.
Yeah, brilliant. Now, thank you for that. One of my favorite themes that I talked about when people MDM is, of course, having a single party view where you just hold, if you've got to hold party information, hold it once and once only. Isn't this really what they ought to be driving towards?
I think it's if you can get to that single party view, great. But what you first of all need to do is get into the to identify across all your silos, at least have a common business glossary of what those parties are, what that data is, so that you're speaking the same language. And you can define that in the context of the processes and functions of the organization.
Excellent. That's Daragh. That's fantastic. With your fantastic knowledge, of course, you're able. I love your gift. Lots of people have fantastic knowledge. They like to demonstrate it by complicating things. You do quite the reverse, and thank you for that.
Well, I'm a bearer of simple brain, John. You should know at this stage.
Yeah, I was going to say I love marmalade too, but that bear of simple brain, he loves honey. It's Paddington loves marmalade. Yeah, fantastic. Daragh, thank you so much for this.
You're welcome, John.
It's been a pleasure to catch up with you again, and once again, fantastic knowledge, and all of the members of Badass will really appreciate it. And so. Thank you, and bye-bye for now, Daragh. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care, John. Bye.